The Galactic Council mocked humanity, then Earth declared silence and war. The chamber laughed at me on a Tuesday. I remember that detail because I had submitted the petition on a Monday, which meant the entire process of humanity's humiliation, 17 pages, 43 citations, 4 years of diplomatic preparation, had taken less than 24 hours, less time than it takes to digest a bad meal. The Galactic Council chamber on Vethara Station smelled like recycled air and old agreements. The ceiling was 300 feet of pale luminite, and every species in the known sectors had a seat beneath it. The Veth sat in the upper tier, their bioluminescent ridges running cool blue, which meant they were bored. The Drethani clustered in the middle rows, quiet as they always were. The Surin delegation had sent 2 representatives instead of their usual 4, which was either a diplomatic signal or a scheduling conflict. I had never been able to tell the difference with Surins. I was in the 3rd row. Earth's designated seat was always in the 3rd row. I had been in this chamber 11 times in 7 years. Each time I sat in the 3rd row, I looked at the back of the Veth counselor's head and thought about how much closer the 1st row looked than it actually was. My name is Marcus Vale. I spent 19 years as Earth's special envoy to the Galactic Council. I filed forms in 4 languages, drank bad coffee on 6 stations, and shook hands or equivalent gestures with representatives of 22 species. I was, by most measurements, a man who was very good at a job that had not produced a single meaningful result. That Tuesday was going to be different. That is what I told myself in the transit pod on the way to the chamber. I had the petition in my bag, on a certified data chip, with a printed backup because the Veth filing system had once lost 3 years of Earth's trade documentation and denied it ever existed. I had prepared responses to every counterargument. I had modeled the likely objections from each delegation and prepared 2-page briefs addressing each one. 17 pages, 43 citations, 4 years. The chamber filled. The session opened. A Drethani clerk read the agenda in 3 languages. I was item 7. Items 1 through 6 were processed without incident. A border resource dispute between the Surin and the Kelari. A trade tariff adjustment for the outer sectors. 2 procedural motions that generated no discussion. A commemorative resolution for a deceased Veth dignitary that passed unanimously and took 11 minutes longer than it needed to. Then item 7. The Drethani clerk called Earth's petition. I stood. I walked to the presentation dais. I placed my data chip in the input port. The display behind me lit up with the opening page of the petition. I began to speak. I had rehearsed this address 40 times. I knew every word. I had timed it at 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I delivered it in 6 minutes and 38 seconds, which I considered a small personal victory. The petition was straightforward. Earth was requesting co-governance rights on 3 frontier sectors in the outer belt, territory that had been unclaimed for 60 years, that no current council member had developed or surveyed, and that Earth had spent a decade quietly mapping at its own expense. The legal foundation was solid. The precedent existed. 2 other species had received similar rights in the previous century. I finished speaking. I stepped back from the dais. The vote happened in approximately 90 seconds. 31 opposed, 2 in favor, 1 abstention from a Drethani delegate who I suspected had pressed the wrong button. I wrote the result on my pad. I capped my stylus. Then Councillor S. Sarath stood. He was the senior Veth representative, 7 feet of bioluminescent certainty, the kind of creature that had been making decisions about the galaxy before humans had figured out that the galaxy existed. His ridges were cycling through gold and amber, which meant amusement. I knew Veth color language well enough to know that much. He spoke in Veth Standard, which the chamber translation system rendered into flat, affectless English in my earpiece. He said the petition lacked merit. He said Earth's development capacity was insufficient for sector governance. He said the Council's decision was both unanimous and self-evident. Then he reached into the folds of his formal robe and produced a small audio device. He placed it on the dais. He pressed play. What came out of the chamber's speaker system was laughter, human laughter, studio audience laughter, bright and layered and unmistakably from a television broadcast. The kind of laughter that meant a joke had just landed. I recognized the show. It was a comedy program from 2031. I had watched it as a child. The chamber responded. Not all of them, but enough. A rippling, cross-species sound that the translation system rendered as general amusement. Sarath's ridges went deep gold. He let the audio clip play for its full 12 seconds. Then he turned off the device and sat down. The Drethani clerk marked the session as closed. I stood at the dais for a moment. I picked up my data chip. I put it in my bag. I walked back to my seat in the third row. I picked up my stylus and I wrote one word in my session notes next to the vote result. Noted. I set it into the dais microphone before I sat down because the session record was still running and I had not been dismissed. One word. Into the microphone, in a perfectly even voice. Then I sat down. Nobody in that chamber understood what that word meant. Nobody understood that the man who wrote it was, in that moment, completely calm. Not the calm of acceptance, not the calm of defeat. Something older than either of those things. The calm of a decision being made very quietly in a place where no one else could see it. The transit pod back to the consulate took 40 minutes. I sat with my bag on my lap and my stylus in my pocket and looked at the window, which showed the stars passing in the long arc between Vethara Station and the consulate dock. I thought about the laugh track. I thought about the specific 12 seconds of it. I thought about the fact that Sarath had prepared it in advance, had brought it to the session, had planned the performance. Then I stopped thinking about it. My hands were resting on my bag. They were completely still. That was the thing that worried me. My hands are never still. I have a habit, 20 years of diplomatic tension, of working the cap of my stylus with my thumb when I am processing something difficult. It is an unconscious motion. I never notice it until someone points it out. My hands were still on the bag. I looked at them for the rest of the 40-minute transit. When I reached the consulate, I filed the session report, marked the petition as denied, forwarded the recorded audio to the Earth Diplomatic Archives, and went to sleep. In the morning, I submitted my resignation as Earth Special Envoy to the Galactic Council. It was approved within 6 hours. I was on a ship back to Earth before the week was out. I did not look at the stars on the way home. The silence started 41 days after I landed back in Geneva. It was not announced. There was no press release, no formal statement, no broadcast. One morning, the Earth Diplomatic Relay Station simply stopped transmitting. Routine trade acknowledgments went unanswered. Scheduled council correspondence was received but not replied to. The automated cargo flight confirmations that ran every 72 hours between Earth's outer stations and Vethara Station, confirmations that had processed without interruption for 11 years, stopped processing. The galaxy noticed on day 12. I know this because I read their communications, not through any dramatic operation. I had the access codes. I had always had the access codes. No one had thought to revoke them from a retired envoy who no longer represented anyone. The Veth Diplomatic Service sent 3 standard inquiry signals in the first week. The tone was administrative, routine follow-up language. The Surin Relay Network flagged the silence as a potential technical malfunction and submitted a maintenance inquiry to Earth's outer station network. The Drethani, more careful than most and always watching for patterns before they became trends, sent a quiet personal message to the Earth consulate in Sector 4. Nobody answered any of it. I was not in Geneva when the silence began. I was 40 meters below Geneva, in a room with no designation on any official floor plan, sitting across a table from 3 people whose names I knew but whose titles I did not. Owen Drake was the one I had worked with before, a narrow, precise man who spoke the way he dressed, which was with no excess anywhere. Patrick Holt sat to his left, heavy-shouldered and quiet, a man who had clearly spent most of his career in rooms where volume was a liability. The third person was a woman I had never met named Claire Arden, who had a tablet in front of her and had not yet looked up from it. There were no windows. I had been in that room for 6 hours before anyone explained why I was there. When Owen finally spoke, he did not explain. He described. There is a difference. An explanation tells you the reasoning. A description shows you the shape. He showed me the shape. Earth had made a decision. Not the government, not the military, not any single institution. Something broader than all of those. A convergence, Owen called it. A point where multiple streams of long-building frustration had reached the same conclusion at the same moment, the way rivers find the sea without being directed. The Galactic Council session had not caused it. It had only made the timing clear. Earth was going to stop performing. I sat with that phrase for a long time after Owen said it. Stop performing. Not stop participating. Not withdraw. Stop performing. As if everything we had done in that chamber for 40 years had been a performance. The petitions, the citations, the diplomatic language, the careful measured tone of a civilization asking to be taken seriously by civilizations that had already decided they would not. The decision, Owen explained, was to be silent for exactly 90 days. No transmissions, no responses, no trade acknowledgments, no presence in council communications. 90 days of complete, deliberate, documented silence. I asked what Earth would be doing during those 90 days. Owen said working. He did not elaborate. Claire Arden had still not looked up from her tablet. That was the whole meeting. I came back to that room many times over the following weeks. Each time, slightly more was shown to me, in the way that trust is extended incrementally, as a test of whether the previous amount had been handled well. I filed nothing from those meetings. I told no one what I heard. I sat in rooms with no floor plan and I listened to the shape of things. The VETH, by day 30, had moved from administrative inquiry to diplomatic concern. Their transmissions were still formal, but the language had shifted. The standard phrases had been replaced with direct questions. Not please advise on status of communications, but we require immediate clarification of Earth's position. I read those and set them aside. The Drethani ambassador, a patient and careful being named Counselor Veth Sarath, sent a personal transmission on day 38, not to Earth's relay, to my personal address, the one that had not been active in any official capacity for 6 weeks. It said, "Marcus, please, what is happening?" Not a question. The punctuation was wrong and the punctuation was right. I stared at that message for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I looked at the clock when it arrived and looked at it again when I started typing. I wrote 2 words. Trade dispute. I sent it. I capped my stylus. I did not feel good about it. I did not feel bad enough to unsend it either. On day 51, a Veth scout vessel entered Earth's outer system. I got the report 6 hours later in the room below Geneva. Patrick Holt read it to me from a single sheet of paper. The scout vessel had entered the outer boundary marker at standard approach velocity, broadcasting a standard diplomatic frequency, requesting communication. It had been met by 12 human ships. I asked what class. Patrick told me. I wrote the number and class on my pad. I looked at it for a moment. Then I crossed out what I had written and wrote the word routine in its place. I filed it in a folder on my pad labeled routine, which by that point contained 47 items, none of which were routine. The scout vessel had been escorted, calmly, wordlessly, without any hostile action and without any communication of any kind, back to the outer boundary. It had departed. The 12 ships had returned to their positions. Nobody fired anything. Nobody needed to. That was the thing about the silence. It did not need to shout. It had weight all on its own. The galaxy had spent 40 years looking at Earth as a small, earnest, optimistic civilization that knocked on doors with petitions and asked politely to be included. The silence removed all of that. What it left behind was a question. A very specific question that every species in the Council was asking by day 60. What is Earth doing in there? On day 81, Counselor Veth Sarath sent another personal message to my address. It said the council was meeting informally to discuss the communications gap. My attendance, in any capacity, would be welcomed. I did not reply. On day 89, Claire Arden finally looked up from her tablet. She looked at me across the table and said, "We are ready to show you the rest." I said, "All right." She said, "It is more than you think." I said, "I assumed." She almost smiled, "Not quite. Day 91, she said, we will need you ready to travel." I went home that evening and slept for the first time in 3 weeks without waking at 2 in the morning. My hands, I noticed before I closed my eyes, were still. The elevator went down for a long time. I had expected a facility. What I got was a network. The elevator descended 200 feet below the Alps into a complex that had been under construction, according to the stamps on the archival documents Owen handed me on the way down, for 11 years. Not 18 months. 11 years. Someone had been patient in a way that I found genuinely unsettling. Neil Garrow was my escort. A quiet man, mid-40s, with the kind of posture that suggested he had spent most of his career carrying things he was not supposed to put down. He did not explain anything as we walked. He opened doors and waited for me to go through them. The first room was the Shipyard Operations Center. Not a shipyard, the Operations Center. A room of screens showing feeds from 17 separate construction facilities across the planet and 3 off-world stations. I stood in front of those screens for 4 minutes without speaking. The ships on those screens were not the ships I knew. Earth's civilian fleet was composed of transit vessels, cargo haulers, and a small number of scientific exploration craft, functional, sensible, built for efficiency. The ships on those screens were none of those things. They were built for something else entirely. The geometry was different. The scale was different. Neil waited. I said, "How long?" He said, 11 years of foundational development, accelerated production in the last 18 months. I wrote the number of active construction bays on my pad. I looked at it. I wrote the word routine next to it out of habit, then looked at what I had written and did not file it anywhere. The second room was smaller. It had a single long table and one screen. On the screen was a document tree, a filing hierarchy for what was labeled the Strategic Doctrine Archive. Owen sat at the table. Claire Arden sat beside him with her tablet. The doctrine was not what I expected. I had assumed weapons, tactics, fleet deployment models. There was some of that. But the architecture of the thing, the foundation it was built on, was not military. It was behavioral. The people who had built this doctrine were not generals. They were scientists who studied how thinking beings make decisions under conditions of fear, uncertainty, and incomplete information. They had spent 11 years mapping every species in the Galactic Council, not their weapons, not their fleet capacities, but their decision-making patterns, the specific conditions under which each species made poor judgments, the specific signals that produced paralysis, the specific moments in a negotiation when a being with incomplete information would overestimate risk rather than gather more data. It was the most thorough piece of applied behavioral science I had ever seen. I sat at the table for a long time. Nobody rushed me. There was a coffee cup on the table, standard issue, white ceramic chipped on the right side of the rim. Someone had scratched their name into the base, Allen, in small, uneven letters, the kind of carving done with a key or a pen nib rather than any proper tool. The coffee in it was cold. The cup was warm, which meant whoever Allen was, he had been in this room recently. I kept looking at the coffee cup, while Owen walked me through the doctrine structure. The cup was the most normal thing in the room. I looked at it the way you look at something familiar when the unfamiliar things around you are too large to hold all at once. Owen finished his overview. I asked 3 questions. He answered 2 of them, the third one. About the projected cost in terms I was not going to specify aloud, he said was outside the scope of the current briefing. I accepted that. Some knowledge is a door you cannot unopen. The third room was a simulation gallery. Laura Hess was there. She was young, 24, maybe 25, the age of people who had been children when the first contact broadcasts aired, who had grown up with the existence of alien life as a settled fact rather than a revelation. She had a direct, clear way of speaking that I recognized as the product of complete confidence in her subject matter. She was not aggressive about it. She simply knew exactly what she was talking about and saw no reason to cushion it. She ran me through the simulation. It was a strategic endgame model, a projection of outcomes given Earth's current capabilities versus Council response scenarios. She walked through it the way someone explains a puzzle they have already solved. Clean, efficient, no hesitation at the difficult sections. She pointed at projected figures and loss ratios with the same tone she used for fleet deployment coordinates. She was not cruel. She was not cold. She was simply someone who had spent 4 years solving a problem and was now showing me the solution. I watched her explain it. I watched her genuine, uncomplicated engagement with the work, and I understood something that I had not understood until that moment. The Council had mocked the wrong generation. They had mocked us, the diplomats, the envoys, the people who had spent decades in third-row seats asking politely and filing paperwork, and hoping that persistence and patience would eventually produce respect. They had made their assessment of humanity based on us, on our generation, on our approach. They had not met the generation that had grown up after the laugh track, the ones who had watched the recordings, processed the humiliation, and then gone into rooms with no windows and spent 11 years building a completely different kind of answer. I was still looking at the coffee cup when Laura finished her presentation. She asked if I had questions. I had one. I asked her what she thought the probability was that none of this would need to be used. She thought about it, a real calculation, not a diplomatic pause. Then she said, "Hi. If the envoy is the right person and the presentation is made correctly, they will understand the math without us having to demonstrate it." She said the envoy, like she already knew who it would be. I looked at Owen. Owen said, "We would like you to go back." I thought about the third-row seat. I thought about the laugh track. I thought about SRF's ridges going gold. I thought about my hands, which had been still for weeks. I said, "Send me the briefing." Before I left that room, I looked at the coffee cup one more time. I thought about asking whose it was. I decided not to. Some things are better left as simply themselves. A chipped cup with a name scratched in the bottom, ordinary and real in a room where everything else had been too large to hold. I signed 3 documents in Owen's office before I took the elevator back up. I used my own pen, the one with the cap I worked with my thumb when I was processing something difficult. My hands were not still when I signed those documents. They had not been still since the simulation. The ship's name was Avery. Not a designation code. A name painted on the hull in white letters above the forward docking collar, the way ships used to be named in the centuries when ocean crossings were uncertain enough to warrant giving a vessel a personality. I had asked Neil about it on the way to the launch dock, and he said the crew had named her. Not command. The crew. That told me something. I boarded alone in the operational sense. There was a crew of 19 people who managed the ship systems, none of whom wore rank insignia, and all of whom acknowledged me with a nod as I passed through corridors on the way to my quarters. My quarters were small and clean and had one viewport that looked out on the dock infrastructure as we departed, and then, once we cleared the station, on open space. I did not sleep much on the transit to Vethara. I spent most of the journey reading, not the briefing materials. I had read those 14 times and could have delivered the presentation from memory. I read a history of the Council's first 2 centuries, a long and careful document written by a Drethani scholar who had an extremely thorough approach to footnotes. I read it not because I expected to find anything useful, but because it kept my hands busy and my mind focused on something with a defined structure. On the 4th day of transit, I ate dinner with 3 crew members in the common room. A man named Gordon Webb who ran navigation, a woman named Ellen Cross who managed the communication array, and a young man named Daniel Firth who was responsible for something involving the drive calibration that he described in terms I did not fully follow, but which he clearly found deeply interesting. We talked about food. We talked about a sports event that had happened the week before departure. We talked about Gordon's daughter, who had recently started school. I told them I had a meeting to get to. Gordon said, "We know." Ellen said, "We are not worried." Daniel said something about the drive calibration. I went back to my quarters and read the Drethani history for another 2 hours. We entered Vethara Station's outer system on the 6th day. Ellen notified me that standard docking approach protocols had been initiated and that the station's traffic control had acknowledged our arrival and assigned a bay. No intercept, no challenge, no request for identification or stated purpose. We docked without incident. I found that more informative than any formal response would have been. The chamber was the same. This is the thing about places where important things happen. They do not change to acknowledge what has occurred in them. The recycled air, the 300-foot luminite ceiling, the rows arranged in their established hierarchy with the Veth in the upper tier, and the third-row seat exactly where it had always been. The same Drethani clerk at the session desk. The same translation system rendering everything into flat, affectless English in my earpiece. I was on the agenda as item 1. I walked to the dais. I set my bag down beside it. I took out my stylus and placed it on the dais surface, capped, the clip facing upward. I looked at the chamber. Every delegation was present. I counted, including 2 Veth sub-counselors I had not seen at any previous session. I looked at Sareth. His ridges were running cool blue. Bored or performing bored. With the Veth, the difference was sometimes a matter of perspective. I placed my data chip in the dais input port. I said, Earth is prepared to resume diplomatic relations with the Galactic Council. We have prepared a summary of our position over the past 18 months. We ask that the record reflect what follows. That was the whole speech. I pressed play on the data chip presentation. What came up on the display behind me was not a petition. It was not a formal address. It was a document formatted in the Council's own standard reporting template, the same structure, the same headers, the same citation format that every species used when submitting verified data to the Council archive. Earth had prepared it in the Council's own language, filed according to the Council's own standards, categorized under the Council's own classification system. The first section was fleet capacity. Numbers, specifications, confirmed by independent survey. Not Earth's self-reported capacity. Independently verified figures, cross-referenced against 3 separate monitoring systems, some of which belonged to Council members who did not know their monitoring data had been accessed. The chamber was very quiet. The second section was infrastructure. Facilities, production rates, resource allocation. The kind of data that tells you not just what a civilization has, but what it is capable of producing, and on what timeline and with what consistency. The kind of data that describes not a moment but a direction. Quieter. The third section was the doctrine summary, not the full archive. A summary, 2 pages of condensed behavioral modeling presented as a research document with citations. It outlined, in clean, measured language, the identified decision-making patterns of 5 council species under conditions of uncertainty and pressure. It included, at the bottom of the second page, a single footnote that read, "Full research archive available on request." The Surin delegation to my left made a sound that did not translate. The fourth section was the silence itself, a timeline of the 90 days with annotations. Not a description of what Earth had done during those 90 days, just the timeline, with specific markers indicating when each council species had reached certain identified threshold states of concern. The timeline had no commentary. It did not need any. The document ended there. The display held on the final page. The chamber held its silence. I looked at Sareth. His ridges had changed color, not gold, not blue, something I had not seen before, a deep, still amber that did not cycle or shift, a color that stayed. I learned later, from a Drethani contact who had studied Veth physiology for 30 years, what that color means. I chose not to look it up at the time. Some knowledge is a weight I did not need to carry into that specific room. The Surin delegate spoke first. He asked a procedural question about the data verification methodology. I answered it in 2 sentences. He wrote something on his pad. 3 other delegates asked questions. I answered each one carefully, accurately, and briefly. Then Counselor Veth Sarath, the Drethani delegate, the one who had sent me the personal message, the one who had typed, "What is happening?" without a question mark because the phrasing itself answered the question. He asked the one I had been waiting for. He said, "What does Earth want?" I picked up my stylus. I did not uncap it, I just held it. I said, "For the record, we want what we asked for 3 years ago, the same petition, the same 17 pages, the same 43 citations." I set the stylus back on the dais surface. The vote will be different this time. Nobody asked me to clarify. Nobody challenged the statement. Sarath had not spoken. He had not moved. His ridges were still that deep, still amber. I looked at him for exactly as long as felt appropriate. Then I picked up my stylus, picked up my bag, and stepped back from the dais. I said, "The record is appreciated." I walked out of the chamber. The hallway outside was empty, long, arched, lit with the kind of light that makes everything look slightly historical. I walked its length without stopping. I passed the transit hub. I passed the docking corridor junction. I stopped at the viewport at the end of the hall. Space outside, stars, Vethara Station's outer dock structure stretching away to the right. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. Not badly. A fine, continuous tremor in both of them, the kind that comes not from weakness but from something that has been held very tightly for a very long time, releasing all at once. I held them up in front of me and watched the tremor for a moment. Then I put them in my pockets. I walked back to the aviary. Gordon was at the dock entrance. He did not ask how it went. He looked at my face and nodded once, the nod of someone who has understood something without being told, and stepped aside to let me board. I went to my quarters. I sat on the edge of the bunk. I uncapped my stylus. I held it for a long time. Then I capped it again and put it away. The vote came through on a Tuesday. 31 in favor, 2 opposed, 1 abstention from a different Drethani delegate than the last time, which meant it was intentional. I read the certified result on my pad in my quarters on the aviary, 4 hours into the transit back to Earth. The format was standard. The Council's official seal, the session date, the item number, the tally. The same flimsy paper, metaphorically speaking, as the paper the original denial had come on. I filed it in a folder I had labeled routine. I sat with it for a moment. I laughed, not a happy laugh, not a triumphant laugh. The specific kind of laugh that happens when something is both exactly what you wanted and nothing at all like you expected it to feel. Ellen knocked on my door and asked if I wanted dinner. I said yes. I ate with the 3 of them again in the common room. Gordon talked about his daughter. Ellen talked about a book she was reading. Daniel explained something about the drive calibration that had apparently gone better than expected on the return trajectory. I ate my meal. I did not mention the vote. None of them asked. It occurred to me that they already knew that news of council votes traveled through Earth systems far faster than a ship in transit, and that they were asking me to dinner not to celebrate but simply to sit with something that did not need to be celebrated to be real. Good people, I thought. All 3 of them. Good, ordinary, completely unremarkable people who had been on the crew of a ship that had just changed the shape of humanity standing in the galaxy. I said thank you when I left the common room. Gordon said, anytime. Daniel started talking about the drive calibration again. The debriefing in Geneva took 3 days. Patrick Holt ran the first session. He was patient and thorough and asked exactly the right questions, which told me he had been preparing for this conversation for some time and had already decided what he wanted to know before I walked into the room. I answered everything accurately. I had filed my session notes on the transit home and they were thorough. On the second day, a committee of 7 people sat across a long table from me in a room with actual windows, the first debriefing room with natural light I had been in for 18 months, and asked me to assess outcomes. I thought about what Laura Hess had said in the simulation gallery. I thought about the 31-2 vote. I thought about the behavioral doctrine archive sitting in a server somewhere, available on request, full of things that no council species wanted Earth to know that we knew about them. I said, we were mocked. We became something that cannot be mocked. I am not certain that those are different problems wearing different clothes. The woman at the center of the table, gray-haired, with the kind of stillness that comes from long practice, asked me to clarify. I picked up my stylus, I looked at it, I set it down. I said, I do not think I will. She wrote something on her pad. On the third day, Owen Drake sat across from me alone in a room with no windows and no floor plan, and he set a document on the table between us with a title printed at the top that I will not write here, and he said, "We would like to offer you a position." The position was not special envoy. It was not any title that appeared in any organizational chart I had ever been given access to. I said, "What are the hours like?" Owen said, "Similar to what you have been doing." I said, "Similar." He said, "Rooms without floor plans, decisions that do not appear on any ledger, the kind of work that happens in the space between what is official and what is actual." I thought about Sareth's ridges going that deep, still amber. I thought about Laura Hess pointing at projected figures, with the clean confidence of someone who had already solved the puzzle. I thought about the 31-2 vote in a chamber that had laughed at us 3 years ago. I said, "Fine." Owen slid the paper across. I signed it. I used my own pen. When I got back to my office, a proper office 3 floors up with a view of the lake, there was a coffee cup on my desk. I stopped in the doorway. White ceramic, standard issue, a chip on the right rim. I walked over and picked it up. I turned it over, scratched into the base in small, uneven letters, "Allen." I set it back on the desk. I asked the building coordinator, a careful young man named Paul Stent who managed the building's operations with quiet thoroughness, how the cup had gotten there. He said he did not know. He said the office had been empty for the previous 18 months while I was on assignment, and that the cleaning service had not reported any items left in the space. I said, "All right." I did not throw the cup away. I did not drink from it either. I left it on the corner of the desk where it was. At some point, someone named Allen had put a coffee cup in a briefing room 200 feet below the Alps, had scratched his name into the base with the tip of a pen, had drunk his coffee and left the cup on the table and gone on with whatever work he was doing. And somehow, in the months since, the cup had made its way here, to my desk. I did not try to explain it. Some things do not need to be explained. They just need to be present. The weeks after the vote were quiet in a different way from the 90 days of silence. That silence had been active, a silence full of movement and construction and calculation, a silence that was doing something. This quiet was the kind that comes after, the silence of a held breath finally released. The galaxy was recalibrating. Council species were reviewing their assumptions. The behavioral doctrine summary was, according to 2 pieces of intelligence I received in the following weeks, being cited in internal memos across 4 different delegation headquarters. Earth's 3 frontier sectors in the outer belt were formally designated for co-governance within 60 days of the vote. The legal process was handled by a junior diplomat named Clara Ashby, who was 29 years old and had filed the original supporting research citations for the petition I had presented 3 years ago. She filed the co-governance paperwork with the same 43 citations, updated for the new date, and received confirmation within 72 hours. I sent her a message that said, "Well done." She wrote back, "We had good source material." I stared at that for a while. I thought about what we had used to produce that source material. 11 years of quiet construction, 90 days of deliberate silence. A fleet that had never fired a single weapon. A doctrine built on understanding rather than force. The fear of what we could do, deployed with careful precision by people who had studied it the way a physician studies a condition, not to give in to it, but to know every corner of it. The galaxy was cautious around us now. The council voted the way it voted because Sarath's ridges had gone that deep amber, and he had not spoken, and he had not played any audio clip, and he had understood, in the way that very old and very careful beings understand things, that the civilization sitting in the third row seat was not the civilization that had sat there 3 years ago. We had not fired a shot. We had not raised a voice. We had not even, technically, made a threat. Everything in the presentation had been factual. Verified data, formatted correctly, cited properly, delivered through the Council's own systems using the Council's own protocols. For the record, we had been entirely within acceptable diplomatic conduct. I found that observation useful in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. At 3 in the morning on a Thursday in October, I sat at my desk with the lake visible as a darkness beyond the window glass, and I thought about Laura Hess. Not about the simulation, about the way she had described the endgame, the clean, puzzle-solving engagement of someone who had grown up in a world where alien life was an ordinary fact, where the humiliation of the laugh track was a historical event she had studied rather than a moment she had lived through. She had not been in the chamber. She had not heard those 12 seconds of studio laughter fill 300 feet of luminite ceiling. She had not written, noted, into a microphone with a voice that required considerable effort to keep level. She had simply looked at the problem, built the solution, and presented it with the kind of calm that comes from never having been the one in the third row seat wondering if patience was enough. I did not know whether that was better or worse. I did not know how to measure it. The window was dark. The lake outside was still. I thought about what we were now, what Earth was now. The petition had been granted. The sectors were ours. The Council voted the way the data said it would vote. Every projection had run exactly as modeled. We were not mocked anymore. The question I could not put down, and I had tried, the way you try to put down a cup that keeps being handed back to you, was what it meant that the way we had stopped being mocked was by becoming something that could not be mocked without serious consequence. The doctrine in the archive was not the product of a civilization that wanted to cause harm. It was the product of a civilization that had grown tired of being dismissed. But the tool that we had built to address one problem was a tool that existed now, in the world, in the servers, in the minds of the people who had built it and would continue to build it, and would hand it to the next generation, the way every generation hands the next generation the things it made under pressure. Laura Hess would use those tools. The people she would train would use those tools. And one day, someone very young and very capable, who had never sat in a third-row seat, who had no memory of the reason those tools existed, would reach for them as naturally as I had once reached for my stylus. I did not know what that meant. I was not sure I was the right person to decide. I opened a new document on my pad. The cursor blinked at me. I had been meaning to write a formal account, an honest record of the 18 months, not the official version, not the filed reports, but the actual shape of it, what it felt like to be in those rooms, what it felt like to watch the thing being built, what it felt like to stand at the dais and say, for the record, and mean something entirely different from every other time I had said those words in that chamber. I typed the title. I looked at it. The cursor blinked. I looked at the coffee cup on the corner of my desk, the chip on the rim, Alan scratched into the base. I thought about Alan, whoever he was. I thought about his coffee cup in a basement briefing room 200 feet below the Alps. I thought about what he had been working on when he left that cup on the table. I thought about whether he knew what had come of all that work, whether he had watched the vote results arrive, whether he had felt what I still could not fully name when the tally appeared on the screen. 31-2 in favor. The same 43 citations. The stars were still out there. I could not see them from the office window, too much light from the Lake District, but they were there, unchanged. The same stars Sarath had been born under. The same stars Earth had looked up at for all the centuries before we knew what was looking back. They looked different to me now. Not smaller. I had thought, on the shuttle back from Vethara 3 years ago, that they might look smaller eventually. That the mystery might reduce once the mystery had names and seats and voting records and laugh tracks attached to it. They did not look smaller. They looked more complicated, more inhabited, more like a place where the things that happened had weight and consequence, and the kind of long aftermath that you feel in your hands at 3 in the morning when the work is done, and the outcome is real, and you are still not entirely sure what you want. I looked at the cursor. I typed the first line of the account. The chamber laughed at me on a Tuesday. I stared at it. Then I typed the second line. I want the record to reflect that we answered. I put my stylus on the desk beside the pad. I did not cap it. I left it there, open, the way you leave a door open when you are not sure yet who will come through it, but you have decided, for the first time in a long time, that you are willing to find out. For the record,